шанс договориться с нашими партнерами по ключевым вопросам, вызывающими нашу озабоченность? Или это просто попытка втянуть нас в бесконечный переговорный процесс, не имеющий никакого логического завершения?
Наши возможности далеко не исчерпаны. Они, конечно, не должны продолжаться бесконечно, но на данном этапе я бы предложил их продолжать и наращивать.
We'll talk a bit more about everything that's been happening out of Russia today. Let's bring in France 24's Armen Georgian. Armen, a lot of things coming out of the Kremlin recently in the past few hours. What do you make out of all of it?
Well, that exchange has been quoted a lot, the one that we just heard between President Putin and Sergei Lavrov. The intent clearly there is to signal that a military action is not imminent. But I think the key thing is when Putin says all right at the end of that exchange, how long is that actually valid for? I mean, how long does the diplomacy continue? Do we then suddenly hear Russian officials say, actually, Russian citizens are being killed in the Donbass and therefore we have no option but to intervene militarily to stop that? Remember that hundreds of thousands of Russian passports have been handed out in the Donbass. So we obviously have to be very careful with any kind of verbal declaration of it or apparent declaration of intent and look at the concrete troop movements, which is what Kiev and Western intelligence agencies will be continuing to look at very closely in the next few days. The Russian Defense Ministry has said that some units have begun to return to their bases after doing drills on the Crimea, but then Crimea is under Russian control anyway, so it does seem a bit early to read anything into the Russian Defense Ministry statement, and obviously the West will be looking at satellite images very, very closely in the next few hours and days.
Armen, the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg is speaking at the moment. He's just said we are ready to discuss NATO-Russia relations. He added as well that we will not compromise on core principles. Those comments coming just as the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz has been speaking to Vladimir Putin today in Moscow. They're about to give a press conference. So what do you make of those latest developments?
Well, the NATO chief has always said that the organization won't compromise on the principle that any country can apply to join NATO if it meets the criteria. But what Olaf Scholz is emphasizing is that this issue is actually not practically on the agenda. And Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, has said, actually, it's not Ukraine's decision. Ultimately, it's up to NATO to decide which countries NATO chooses to admit. So I think there's a slight change of emphasis in what Zelensky said on that topic. And Olaf Scholz obviously will be taking this message to Putin in talks today, saying, look, in practical terms, yes, okay, in principle, NATO has this open door policy, but he will emphasize the fact that it's not practically on the agenda. But what will Scholz actually do? Will he give some kind of reassurance to Putin behind closed doors that Scholz will use his influence to try to continue to keep the issue practically off the agenda for a number of years? And would Putin accept any such reassurance? After all, Germany is not the only player in all of this. And also, kind of behind the scenes pledges or commitments are precisely the kind of thing that Putin has said the West has given in the past and not respected. So any kind of pledge or reassurance doesn't sit easily with Putin's own demand that the West provide written guarantees that Ukraine will not join NATO, because after all, Putin has built this whole narrative for years that the West cannot be trusted. So anything that Western officials tell him in private talks, that is a pretty hard sell for Putin at this point, I would think.
All right, Armen, thanks for that. France 24's Armen Georgian.